your final is quickly approaching, and at this point you're probably cramming to try to remember everything we've talked about this semester, and there certainly is a lot. So first of all, let's take a deep breath. Today we're going to review Romanticism. First of all, let's take a look at what we're going to talk about in today's video. So first of all, we're going to talk about understanding Romanticism as a reaction to Enlightenment values. This is really important because these romantic reactions really seep into everything we're going to discuss today. Then we're going to turn to romantic literature, taking a closer look at Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Diary of a Madman by Nikolai Gogol, and the poems of Emily Dickinson. Then we're going to look at some examples of romantic art and learn how to quickly identify romantic art, because this is a skill you will need on your final exam. And then finally, we're going to do a brief overview of romantic music with Symphonie Fantastique by Hector Berlioz. Let's go ahead and take a look at this chart. This is a chart that we've seen in a couple of lectures, including the lecture over Hoffman and Gogol by Martha Kristen. So you've definitely seen this visual before. So let's explore it a little bit further and what it actually means. The Enlightenment, first of all, focused a lot on sovereignty of reason as a reaction to this. The Romantic period focused more on irrational ways of knowing through visions, poetic imagination, drug experiences and dreams, and even madness at times. And so this was definitely also a reaction to the Enlightenment's distrust of imagination. Next up, the Enlightenment had a focus on the consensus experience and the human universal experience, and as a reaction to this, the Romantics definitely focus more on an individual experience and the exception, such as the genius. Next, the Enlightenment definitely viewed nature as a order and system. The Enlightenment was a space safe for scientific discoveries, materialism, and empiricism, which is the idea that all knowledge is from sense experiences. The Romantics had a different take on nature. They viewed it as spirit and mind, sometimes even as a religion. And they were also more suspicious of science and industry with the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Enlightenment thinkers also believed in deism, which is the idea that there's a higher power that's the creator of the universe, but it does not interact with humankind. The Romantics reacted to this by starting to view art as a religion and poets as prophets. And then lastly, the Enlightenment highly focused on aesthetics of order, which included balance and proportion, beauty, how well things were made, and it was more of a focus on the achievement rather than the intention of the work. The Romantics couldn't probably get more opposite from this. They were focused on the aesthetics of the extreme, which included the sublime, which we'll talk about more later, and new hybrid genres that didn't force things into one box, seeing things in a fragmented way, and also more on the intention of the work rather than the achievement of the work as well. Now we're going to talk about romantic literature. This is capital R romantic, so things probably won't be getting too steamy. We're going to focus on Frankenstein, Diary of a Madman, and Final Harvest. So first of all, we have Frankenstein, and so Frankenstein has quite a few romantic themes in it. The first one being the sublime nature and how it brings together terror and beauty to affect the mood throughout the novel. The sublime is so let's talk about what the sublime is. This is the kind of quality of greatness that is beyond calculation, measurement, or imitation for us as humans. And so one example that Mary Shelley is the fog during Walton's voyage. These descriptions of nature throughout the novel not only push the plot forward, but affect the characters' moods. During this time period, there was also a lot of experimentation with galvanism, which is the idea that you could make muscle contract by stimulating it with an electric current. This was a popular theory that galvanism could possibly restore life, and this is where the idea for Victor Frankenstein's monster came in. This could possibly be seen as an alternative way of knowing, because the reanimation of life brings us a different point of view as well. Frankenstein has many different layers, but one of them could be a focus on mental illness, because, for example, Victor Frankenstein's monster haunts him, much like our unconscious can haunt us. And there's also something to be said for Victor's mental health after he created the monster and then completely abandoned it. Finally, Frankenstein also employed this idea of an interpolated narrative, which is the idea that there's a narrative inside of a larger narrative. So the narrative with Victor Frankenstein and his monster fits into the larger narrative involving Walton and the letters to his sister as well. Frankenstein is a book with a lot of layers, and I'm sure you could have a much larger discussion on the romantic aspects of this book, but I think these are some of the most important ones that you should be prepared to talk about in class. Alrighty, so now we're going to talk about Diary of a Madman and Final Harvest. So let's first of all talk about the discussion of mental health in Diary of a Madman. So I think this is really obvious just from the title of the work, but you could definitely say that the narrator of this work is an unreliable one, because we can't really say that Paprician's perception is accurate. And also that we know he's gone mad because of his rank in Russian society, and he's, because he's one place away from having a status being hereditary, which seems to drive him mad, even though he has absolutely no family he could pass on his position to. And at one point, Paprician announces that he's the king of Spain, and the story starts to look a lot like Don Quixote, which is another madman that we know quite a lot about because of this class. Next up, this short story does a really great job of alternative ways of knowing, just because of the letters from the dogs. So the dogs seem to have more of a grasp on reality than our narrator does. So this really keeps the reader on the edge of their seat. This also feeds into the idea of fantastic hesitation, which really keeps the reader suspended between this belief and disbelief of the supernatural. In this short story, it also helps employ the multiple narratives that were pretty popular in these romantic works as well. Alrighty, so we're going to go ahead and talk about Final Harvest by Emily Dickinson. So this is quite different from Diary of a Madman, but Emily Dickinson really ended up being one of my favorite authors we studied this summer, and I think what our lecturers said was so true, is that it really does take 2 or 3 readings of her poems to fully understand them. So if one of them ends up on the exam, make sure you give yourself time to go ahead and read it a couple of times and really annotate that text, because it definitely takes a lot to fully understand them. Dickinson also poems also fall into several themes we discussed in lecture as well. And first of all, she was definitely erring on the side of transcendentalism, which is the idea of understanding nature as a religion. And she also has several poems that explore this idea. And so we also know that she wasn't exactly a fan of organized religion in her personal life as well. Next, Dickinson liked to experiment with poetic form, which was common of the Romantic time period. She used an array of periods, commas, and other punctuation marks like dashes. She also experimented with different meters and forms of stanzas, which really adds to the variety of her work as well. And finally, there are hints of suspicion of industry in Dickinson's work. We're going to explore a poem on the next page that explores this a little bit further. I think this is something that we discussed on an earlier slide, but it's not a huge theme in Dickinson's work, but I just wanted to make sure you had an example of it moving forward, because this is an important romantic theme, and I just want to make sure that you guys have a good example of it going forward. So we're going to go ahead and look at this poem. So this kind of, there's like word choice in this poem, supercilious, which means when someone thinks that they're superior to others. Horrid and docile are words that make it seem like Dickinson and people at this time were wary of the Industrial Revolution, because this poem is about a train traveling, and so it's kind of like saying that they're superstitious about these kinds of things, and so that makes sense for this poem. Awesome. So now that we've reviewed 3 pretty big authors from this time period, let's turn to romantic art and discuss that a little bit further. Alrighty, so next up we're going to look at some important themes that can be found in romantic art. So first of all, we have romantic landscapes, which there's a greater focus on nature than the people in the landscape. Next, we have a focus on individual subjectivity, which is just there's a lot of focus on the deeply emotional, which is definitely something that the Romantic and Baroque periods have in common. So when looking at these paintings, and you really have to make sure you know the other kinds of signs of these paintings to determine their time period, really. We can also look at the sublimity of nature, which just like the sublimity of nature that we focused in Frankenstein, this kind of sublime focused on depictions of nature. We also have political comments on current events of the time period. Several paintings use their artwork to comment on significant happenings during this time period, and we'll actually look at an example of this later. Next, we have exoticism, which is just people who are very interested in other cultures and people outside of themselves from other places and things happening there as well. And then finally, we have this concept of the fantastic and the exploration of the human psyche, which I think the painting on the right side of the screen really brings these last 2 points together. So it's an exploration of fantastic. So if we look at this painting, it's called The Night Beer by Henry Fuseli. And if we look at it, it's this monster with sitting on this lady while she's sleeping, and she's draped over this bed, and then there's a horse coming in to look. So it's kind of, it's fantastic because you're not really sure if the monster's real because the horse is reacting to it, but maybe it's just is an exploration of the human psyche because maybe that's what her nightmare is about. And so it's kind of interesting to look at it in those terms as well. Okay, now let's go through some tips on how to quickly identify romantic artwork. So if we look at some of the colors in romantic art, they're definitely more muted colors compared to Baroque art. We also see that there's noticeable brushstrokes with dramatic scenes. So if we look, we can actually see the brushstrokes, especially when it comes to like skies and nature scenes and things like that. There's also a prominent sky, so oftentimes you'll see romantic art and you'll have the sky taking up most of the image, which is definitely a really big sign that it's a romantic piece. A focus on nature, so whether this is sublime nature or pastoral scenes, things like that, there's definitely a focus on nature as it is like related to humans. And then finally we have horrific or gothic images like the nightmare painting we just saw by Henry Fuseli. So next up we have a romantic landscape. So these kinds of pastoral landscapes were really supposed to celebrate the authority of nature over man. This is why people aren't featured in these landscapes or take up very much space in them. It's also celebrated that nature provided for humans in these peaceful scenes that often include ripe harvests, lovely gardens, manicured lawns, or fattened livestock. And these kinds of pastoral and picturesque looks at nature as are very different from the sublime because it kind of suggests that humans can control nature as opposed to the sublime. Next up, we're going to talk about these two paintings, Lady Liberty, Leading the People by Eugene Delacroix. You may know this as the album cover for Coldplay's album Viva la Vida. Delacroix wanted to commemorate the July Revolution that removed Charles X from the throne. An example of a romantic artist making a comment on a contemporary event of this time. So maybe you don't know about that event in particular, not a history buff, that's okay. You can definitely tell this piece is romantic because of the muted colors and the brushwork in the sky, as well as I think just the drama in the scene that's depicted along with these things. You can definitely tell it's a romantic piece overall. And then finally, on the right side of the screen, we have this painting by Caspar David Friedrich known as Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. This is another nature scene, however, this time it's much more of a sublime look at nature. This is the Sea of Fog is more than a person can wrap their mind around. It's also interesting because you have the wanderer is viewing something, but we can't see what it is because they have our back to us, so we're not seeing completely what they're seeing, which is a really interesting thing, and it's also very common of Caspar David Friedrich's work. Also, we have this painting is romantic because of its focus on nature, and we can tell it's sublime because it's kind of like coming at us at full force. And we can also tell because of the brushstrokes, and even though the person is the center of the painting, most of the focus is on the nature. Alrighty, so now we're going to take a quick look at some romantic music. The only piece we definitely studied this semester regarding romantic music is Symphonie Fantastique by Hector Berlioz, but it's a really important piece. It was one of the first examples of program music that we had a chance to look at, and so this kind of program music really like gave us a story behind the music that we were looking at, which is a different take on music that we've previously seen. Also, during this time period, the actual orchestra grew in size a lot. There were more instruments, which means there were more colors to the music, which is really interesting and important. And then finally, because this music had a story behind it, we definitely have more of a focus on the inner emotional experience that people have with the music and things like that. And so this music was really meant to invoke the listener's emotions and stuff like that. So we're going to play a clip of Symphonie Fantastique to finish out this video, and good luck on your final. You can do it. Definitely just make sure you take your time to read the passages and review different aspects of all of these different things in the different literature, and know the different writers' writing styles, and just really know the big themes of all the works before you go into the final. And good luck.